Ondreička is a freelance curator and occasional artist based in Bratislava and Vienna. He was artistic director of Vienna Contemporary, director of Transit SK, co-curator of Class of Interpretation, and curator of TBA 21. His curatorial and artistic projects include Manifesta 2 and 8, Olafur Eliasson Green Light at TBA 21, and exhibitions at institutions such as MoMA, PS1, New Museum, BAG, HKW, and the Streichi Herbst. His talk is titled The Second Contemporary.
Hello, many thanks for having a chance to be in this wonderful accumulation of people and new friendships and great hospitality and organization. Okay. The arts, thanks in significant part to the serfdom patent mobility and the toleration patent pluralism, both 1781 in our region, moved away from work based on commissions. Commissions meant expressing the world of others. Art moved vehemently towards the expression of the self. Serf was forced to modulate to self. Thus, from the 19th century onwards, we also distinguish more precisely between free art and applied art. I use free instead of fine. At the first, that's how fine arts is called in my native language, volné umenia. But also because fine, coming from etymological root of finis, the end, means definite, delicate, high. And contemporary arts is anything but nothing like that in general. Free art is unconditioned, while applied art is conditioned. Free art's expression of the I is part of the complexity of individuation. Individuation was the construction of one, certainly the modernist ideal. But one, in understanding of modernists, was we, which leads us closer to applied art, or everybody, in the absolute contrast to what I call the second contemporary, where one is I and anybody. On this schematic basis, I test how useful contemporary art can be for us in looking at the parameters and mechanisms of identity today. Even used by Giorgio Vasari already in 1568, the term contemporary art, in today's sense, was unofficially coined by the English painter, art dealer, critic, and one of the first curators, Roger Fry. This was how he hand-labeled crates with the most recent French paintings of his era in his London warehouse in 1903. Style of that art had not yet been classified. In his case, it was a spontaneous, improvised, provisional, pre-phenomenological phrase associated with time and not yet a term, an ism. He himself later, in 1906, named that trend post-impressionism. It should be noted that as early as in 1870, impressionism had been named postmodern painting by his colleague John Watkins Chapman. Fry's post-impressionism was an economic, pragmatic, generalizing umbrella for many yet unfiled styles. In his biography, his close fellow, Virginia Woolf, put the situation this way. In any case, he must have realized that there was another force at work in contemporary art, which appealed much more to his own instincts and satisfied both intellect and sensibility. This force, which he later named post-impressionism, gave him and many others the freedom to become themselves. Fry, along with Alfred H. Barr, Clive Bell, and Clement Greenberg, were the first to define avant-garde modernism, not as a continuum, but as an autonomous practice vis-à-vis the pioneering styles of the late 19th century. Interestingly, Hans Arp and L. Lisitsky's Kunstismen publication recorded 16 dominant isms in 1924, and flowcharts of the influence of Alfred H. Barr in 1936, already dozens more. We can register a massive fragmentation or fractalization of art of that period. I put this fragmentation, fractalization, as demonstrated with the example of Cubism up here, in direct connection to fragmentation, fractalization of an idea and realization of self. I expose Cubism as the most influential method of art of the last 2 centuries, breaking the form, triumph over elusiveness of time and space, deformity as a tactics of expression of dynamics heading towards future. That convenes with the aspect of the contemporary very much. Frey, manifesting himself as an individualist anarchist, co-founded one of the very first institutions of contemporary art, the Contemporary Art Society, already in 1910. It served as an advisory service for private collectors, while at the same time pooling private capital to purchase the most contemporary art. It then donated this to leading museums. In this way, it has been instrumental in accelerated spread, appreciation and adoption of new trends. Donations were speculative shifts of conversations to conversions, of subjective to objective, private to public, value to price. Subsequently, a number of institutions began to emerge with the attribution of contemporary. For example, the Institute of Contemporary Art, ICA Boston, which opened as the Boston Museum of Modern Art in 1936, changed its name to Contemporary in 1939. Speaking about the contemporary and its pioneering institutions being here in this particular institution, I just must quote Peter Osborne's wrong nostalgic mystification from his very popular Anywhere or Not at All Philosophy of Contemporary Art 2014, who mentions that the distinction between modern and contemporary was first stabilized after 1945, not in Western art history, but in Eastern Europe, as part of the Soviet reaction against the categories of modernity and modernism. For Georg Lukács, for example, in 1950s, socialist realism was contemporary realism, since the actuality of socialism defined the historical present. And now we go. The City Gallery of Contemporary Art, Galeria Suvremene Umjetnosti in Zagreb, founded in 1954, was one of the very few art institutions to use the term before 1960s. In Eastern Europe, modernity was considered an ideological misrepresentation of the historical time of capitalism, covering over its internally antagonistic class forms of historical temporality and representation. The awareness of contemporary's powerful momentum and precariously rapid erosion of isms also altered the procedural typology of its institutions. They began to concentrate on the production of temporary exhibitions as opposed to collecting activities. Thus, against modernist sustainability dream, a preference for possibility of the ambiguous outcome of the contemporary became apparent. The investment in temporariness also expressed a disbelief in the long but strong current confidence. Encounters of the overwhelming multiplicity of the individual in art caused certain average neutrality, and so spaces for the temporary presentation of unpredictable art were meant to be sterile. The first white cube was the Vienna Secession Building, 1898. Secession means separation. Detachment has since become one of the most fundamental internal features of avant-garde. Frey's contemporary art, I call it the first, was the roof of still lack of categorization which it longed to fulfill ismically. It was the absence that bordered. Ismic ambition was the dynamic of creating a more unifying one we to the point of quasi-post-Catholic entitlement to everything. We was certainly some panic reaction to be altered from serf to self involuntarily. So consequently, being radically alienated, losing the security of serfdom. But the ultimately dominating personal authorial individualism and the internal nature of the modern in its pull to be a priori new and preferably first original, permanently disrupted the unity. Secession was not only a separation from the old, but of a single person, I, from its own generational group, we as well. Thus, the history of contemporary art, rather than a non-linear relay races of parallel constructive isms, must be read as a disparate number of always destructive, transgressive and subversive acts of single individuals. It is a history of demands for unbridled freedom of what can be art, which we can synonymize with ontological self-determination at large, all the way to Joseph Beuys's 1971 legislative declaration, jeder Mensch ein Künstler. Anything declared to be art by the first person is art, and from that point on, no second person has any tools to contradict that it is not. But more than similar posture was formulated much earlier by John Dewey in 1932. Looking at it from today's perspective, the postmodern, or in other words, late modern, or neo, or trans-avant-garde, or late capitalism, as predicted by Werner Sombart already in 1919, including Russian perestroika, was then not an effort to resuscitate the modern, but only a rainbow firework display of its agony, ending with the iconic 1989. The godfather of socialism, an entrepreneur, Henri de Saint-Simon, in a dialogue with banker Benjamin Olinde Rodriguez, introduced the militant term avant-garde in 1824, according to his belief that art is the fastest way how to influence any social change. Avant-garde means the array of inexperienced, unarmed, barefoot infantry, which comes from the word child. From the perspective of today, we can consider the unconscious self-image of the infantile avant-garde as a self-annihilating struggle between a constructive we and destructive I, doomed to extinction in advance. Presence of self-identification with infantry, child, suggests to us that the avant-garde carried a certain congenital Peter Pan syndrome of unwillingness to grow up, to remain perpetually adolescent, a continual becoming and not yet being. It is an effective strategy which allows one to ask parents, society, for protection, support, tolerance with disobedience. Right because of this tolerance, art is allowed to be the fastest discipline indeed. Emblematic 1989 was the end of the isms. I was 20 by then. No isms means no categorization, no classification, no equality, no unity. We can say that this is the end of we in art. We can speculate if this is not also the end of left in art as well. The term contemporary reappears after 1989, but no longer as any safety cocoon where new isms are born, but quite the opposite. It is the exclusive incubator of I. Absence here is not a place of fulfillment, but an attempt to allow landless freedom. It is that universal neutrality, void of the white cube mentioned. And void is a synonym of both chaos and freedom. The second contemporary is an autonomous practice vis-à-vis modernism. For the return of the contemporary, I call it the second contemporary. If Fry's the first contemporary was not classified yet, the second contemporary is not classified anymore. What they both still have in common is complete improvisation in a totally provisional situation. Improvisation and provision share a common core. Provis presupposes imagination, and so the effort to break out of time away. It is the rigorous acquisition of a barefoot, cruel freedom which logically excludes any certainty. It is no longer liquid, but gaseous. The diffusion which spreads out in all excludes in all directions and thus has no tenacious shape, rejects responsibility, and so rejects governance. Because to be free means not only to be not governed by others, but also to not govern by yourself. If it refuses to govern, it ceases to claim many societal roles and recognitions. When we say gas, we may also think of personal psyche, anima, soul, and leaking superpersonal pneuma, spirit, the Gnostic idea of self-destructive dematerialization as a process of becoming. Dematerialization is one of the leading meta-receipts of the art of 20th century. When we say gas, full gas, we speak about extreme speed. The second contemporary is an infinite resignation on big goals, big names. Small is more. Counterintuitive, the second contemporary did not come as a movement. It had no manifesto, only an embryonic motivation of a kind of subconscious eureka without the indication of an increased heartbeat. It was not accompanied by neither enthusiasm nor sarcastic decadence. It was merely a change of movement totally unrecorded in its inception. something uncommunicated that we only noticed was already there. It still does not bother, and so there is no longer inclination to investigate, much less name it. To not name means deliberation from formal language and definiteness. In 1989, there was a lack of provocative foreshadowing because there was not even a symptom outwardly revealing some hidden deeper tension, for there was no longer any sickness. Contrariwise, burnout and the subsequent expiration of modernism, the isms themselves, signified the unburdening, the cure against hope. Loss of hope thus dissolved the desire for domination. When I say that there was no longer any sickness, I'm also thinking of famous Antonio Gramsci's prophetic statement of 1930. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Today is crisi, and so the fenomeni morbosi no longer work at all. That the old is dying and new cannot be born is valid, but the second contemporary not only does not mind it, but welcomes it. If no new can be born, it means that everything remains the property of us alone, in Stirnerian 1844 sense. And so, if we agree that a second contemporary yet crisis is, and is major, and unchangeable, it is, then we can consider it statistically as normal. This negates the notion of crisis. So we have rather rationally or subconsciously learned to live in it, or at least to circumvent it, to ignore it. So we emotionally and aesthetically neutralized it. It was modernism that was the crisis and fatal morbidity, its quasi-feudal appetites. So the Gramsci's interregnum, or Schumpeter's intermezzo, was actually 200 years long. That waiting died. When I mention gas, I think of naive modernism burnout by the feverishness of avant-gardes. So it also burned away all the inner sickness, which was also hope mentioned. The second contemporary is hopeless, and that means curing ourselves also of the eschatologically messianic necro of modernism's entitlement to everything. The second contemporary is not everything, but anything. Hopelessness means lightness. Lightness means mobility. If there are no internal diseases, then there are no symptoms to respond to either. And so the second contemporary is no longer referential, but merely non-manifestatively interferential. If I mention provisionality, improvisation, and the absence of categorization, the only way to discern, to navigate the hyperpluralism or even solipsistic egotism of the second contemporary might be ad hoc. Ad hoc means, for this purpose, what is available from case to case, hypothetically, we will see. Ad hoc is always only finite unit in a kind of relay of inauthentic ephemeralities. And so it requires constant attention as a permanently active, highly empirical and experimental mode of orientation and organization. There is no internal memory anymore, but the cognitive loop of external reminding, hyper-reactive on over-impulse network nature of everything. If we inflect adaptive, integrative, flexible, creative, spontaneous, ad hoc, we can talk about ADHOCISM and ADHOCRACY. ADHOCRACY is an organic, maximally adaptive, mobile, promiscuous, and minimally formal managerial structure based on a decentralized, distributed network of independent expert contractors as a possible opposition to state bureaucracy. If individuation means this division, which sounds like the modernist intention, and that has failed, then identity today must be seen in reverse as dividuation, secession. Division, dispersion, secession was precisely the very counterintuitive naturel of the avant-gardes, which gradually shattered from within into grains of dust, gas, fog of the second contemporary. Dividuation sees I diasporically scattered piecemeal in the sense of mycorrhizal dispersal. No roots, just cosmic wireless nets of mutually compatible and thus attracting fragments. Migrating material sympathy, as Jane Bennett 2014 might put it. Speaking about disintegration, Fernando Zalamea, 2011, describes the process of decay as an expression of a profound continuity in nature through which creativity expands without break. So, how can the second contemporary, being with us for 35 years already, still be contemporary? It is because contemporary, contempus, with time, does not mean being with time, but going with time. That's an expression of its gigantic mobility and adaptability as basal qualities of this post-apocalyptic survival. So, if we identify the development of art since the beginning of the long 19th century, modernism, or modernity as a history of individuation, and this process has failed, we will understand it not only as an unsuccessful project, but as a wrong concept per se. We will read the origins of the second contemporary not as a history of convergence, but as a saga of divergences. Then, the crisis of identity means a mistaken manipulation with wrong subject, the subject which has roots in nobility's exteriorization of existential responsibility for serfs on their shoulders. We are not dealing with identitas, which means sameness, but diversitas. Let's mention that the term person comes from Greek prosopon, which means face, appearance, mask, used in ancient theater to denote a character or more generally a social role. Mask, such a strong component of Cubist, compressionist and expressionist depictions. So what if the second contemporary provides us with an embellished entry into reality, or actually anticipates it, art as the fastest of all disciplines? What if the second contemporary is the best laboratory expert of individuation? What if so-called identities, and with that the Western ethos itself, are already only something non-ismic, non-canonical, apocryphal, marginal, timeless, micro-eternal, endless series of ephemeralities, amorphous, abstract, transparent, so that's why invisible. In words of Thomas Metzinger, 2003, dark and scary. Immeasurable, purely aesthetic and symbolic, individualistic, subjective, orphan, alien, multicultural, syncretic, apolitical, amoral and immoral, unfair, eclectic, anarchic precariat, which is necessarily predatory, generationless, ageless, classless and genderless, as merged by Eric Olin Wright, 2012, meta-intuitive, super-adaptable, mobile, promiscuous, prostituting, hopeless, inconsistent, contradictory, polemic, like combustion engine, infinitely resigning, cynical, which means ascetic in one, and hedonistic in other at the same time, chimerically free, which means absent, totally uncertain and cruel, disparate, aerosol, dispersed ad hoc, as Otto Rank, 1907, commented sublimation of internal desires into socially acceptable behavior, and fast without any restraint. What if the second contemporary is, in words of Laboria Kubonix, 2015, a DIY politics of pure alienation? What if even capitalism itself is already so fragmented that it has lost any consistence of ism? So Schumpeter's 1942 creative destruction, which gives the space for new, is not needed anymore, because the infection of arrogant hope was burned out already in 1980s and just left the most fertile compost all around. What if consistency, another mode of failed individuation, the fetish of philosophical method, is just an obsolete, functionless prototype of modernity? What if the journey is the goal indeed? What if we do not question, with Frederick Jameson, 2003, what will be after the mirage of the end of history, because the end is here already, but it is an infinite interval of decay. Hakim Bern, 1990, relay race of temporary autonomous festivities, rejection of one revolution, but hailing of many revolts. Jakob Taubes' 1947, history, which is constructed only by decisive and dividing acts, or the concept of progress made by a relatively small group of highly organized individuals, secret, hermetic, esoteric conspirators, in the sense of Auguste Blanqui, 1872. What if that decay already went through a process of distillation, so turned to an alcohol we use for disinfection and suppressing social hardship, drinking is hell? Yes, what if identity now, which I used to call identifiction, is only an abstract field of associations and expressions which does not keep any formally sustainable structure anymore? What if abstraction is the most proper method of contemporary realism? So even we forget any former modernist hallucinatory answers of revolutionary unification and philosophical consistency, we don't have to resign on avant-garde revels, because, I repeat, the second contemporary art is the fastest of all disciplines anyhow. I somehow feel that the second contemporary behaves similarly to raw and cruel nature. It is an ad hoc quasi-regulation of chaos magic, of egoisms based on irrational confidence with others. These days, I feel very much the same as what half Rabbi Jacob Taubes wrote to jurist Carl Schmitt in 1942. I have no spiritual investment in the world as it is. But that does not mean that I have no spiritual investment in the world as it should be.